Yes, they are. You know, this is church, and there's such a thing as having too much fun. You keep it up, and they're going to think you're Pentecostal or something. Then wouldn't people start talking? You know that church out there. I saw this thing the other day about this little old lady, and her daughter took her to church. She was visiting her daughter and said, "I want you to come to church with me." So she went to church with her. It happened to be Charles Stanley's church, First Baptist Church of Atlanta. Okay, big church, and a big wraparound uh, balcony, kind of like a horseshoe kind of a thing. And they didn't get there early enough, so they ended up on the balcony. Got over, and they ended up sitting on the far end of the balcony. And she says, "I'm sitting there and I'm looking." And she says, all of a sudden during the singing, there's this lady. She said, "I could look right across and see the other end of the balcony. And there's this lady over there, and she's waving at me. And she's just waving at me." She said, "So?" Thinking, how in the world does she know me? And so I start waving back at her. And before you know it, she says, all kinds of people start waving at me. And she said, "I didn't know there were so many people that would..." Well, of course, you get the idea, right? They weren't waving. They were worshiping, but to her, they were waving at her, so she was waving back. Yep. Yes, yes, yes. Can the Ethiopian change his skin or the leopard his spots? Well, of course, it's rhetorical, right? And Jeremiah is correct. Then you can do good who are accustomed to do evil. In other words, if those things can happen, well, then the same thing is true. You could do good, but you can't. The wicked can in no way do what is right and what is good in the sight of God. It is impossible to change one's skin color, unless, of course, you're Michael Jackson. And even that wasn't really successful. Okay? Look kind of camoed, spotted up, and all that. Well, listen. The point that Jeremiah is making is that evil is entrenched in our character. And we've gone through this. We've talked about this. It is like a diseased tree that cannot bear any good fruit. An unbeliever, because of their depravity, which is inherited, right, is enslaved to the foolishness of this world. They are. They cannot begin to understand spiritual things of God in a saving way. If a sinner is to be born again, it is going to be due to God working in that person's life, not to the will of man. We are unable to save ourselves. We've talked about spiritual depravity, and we're talking about this whole idea of what our needs are and what we're able to accomplish in and of ourselves. Our bondage, our spiritual inability, we have to understand what we're talking about here. It's our spiritual inability. First and foremost, it means that there is no way that we can meet the perfect demands of God's holiness. It's not possible. Not possible. We are not able to turn toward God in faith and repentance in and of ourselves. Now, I want that to sink in for a moment. We are not able to turn to God in faith and repentance in and of ourselves. You agree with that statement or not? Oh, that's exactly the point. All right, lesson's over. We can go home now. Yes, if we could do something to save ourselves, then what's the point of Jesus dying on the cross? Right? It doesn't work that way. Secondly, spiritual inability means that we are unable to overcome or even to change our inclination to sin in order for us to love God instead. Again, can a leopard change his spots? No. Point well taken. Because we are born with a corrupt nature, we are predisposed toward sin. We are not able to perform any deed that is pleasing in God's sight. It's not possible. We cannot please God. When Paul wrote, "There is none righteous, no, not even one," he means everybody. Now, that doesn't mean that we have lost all reasoning. That doesn't mean that we have lost common sense. That doesn't mean that we don't have knowledge, or that we don't have a conscience, or that we don't have a will. No, it's not talking about that. Those faculties remain intact. But what it does mean is that mankind by nature has, listen very carefully now, we have an irresistible predisposition to evil. So even though our rational faculties remain, those rational faculties are inclined towards sin. In other words, do we have the ability to impact, to influence our will? Do we have, no, I said that wrong. Do we have free will? Yes, we do. Otherwise, we're all Calvinists. Right? And then, boy, we have some real issues. So yes, we do have free will, but that free will, and I use the term free very loosely, is a free will to choose, which will always choose a certain way. Now, Cuz, I'll call you Cuz because you're Cuz. Okay. So, Cuz, if Uncle Josh says, "Hey, I'll give you a choice. You can either have this delicious, soupy summer squash or your favorite ice cream. Which are you going to choose?" See, somehow I knew you were going to screw up my illustration. You can go back home anytime. We're going to choose what we like. Okay? We're going to choose what we like. We're going to always choose toward that which we desire. Now, the problem with that is we are predisposed to desire sin. And so if we ever choose contrary to sin, it is only because of the power of the gospel that is evident within us. Because in and of ourselves, we are predisposed to choose that which we desire, and we as sinful creatures desire sin. And we always choose that way. Make sense? Okay. So, spiritual inability is not only bondage to sin, it is willful bondage. It is willful bondage. There are a lot of people that object to spiritual inability, and they basically say that, listen, if we are unable to obey God, then we can't be held responsible. Well, now that's Calvinism. But there really is no such inconsistency, because we are responsible for our sin, even though we realize that while we are enslaved to sin because it is our nature and we inherit it from Adam, that slavery is a willful one. Now, this is the kind of thing that ought to really start blowing your mind here. Yes, we are slaves to sin. But the reason that we are slaves to sin is because we choose to be. We choose to be. It's the same idea as if Chef Max makes a fantastic gourmet meal. Man, he is like Ratatouille Max all over the place. Okay? Now, if you've never had ratatouille, have you ever had ratatouille? No? Okay, you don't know what you're missing. It's good stuff. So Ratatouille Max has this incredible meal that he's made, and Ellie comes along, and Max says, "Look, I made this fantastic meal. You know, I'm not even going to charge you. Sit down, enjoy." And Ellie says, "Well, what is it?" He's got, 5-course meal. I've got this, and so on and so on. And Ellie says, "You mean I can have anything I want?" And he says, "Yep, take your pick." And she goes over and she lifts the lid off the trash can and she starts eating out of the garbage. Okay? The point is, she chose that. She's enslaved to it because she chose it. Now, Ellie, you would never do that. No. Nor would Max be this master chef either. But we'll let him wallow in that for a little while. Okay. So sure, okay. So yes, while we are enslaved to sin, that slavery is a willful one. Why? Because we love to sin. We love to sin. We love it. It's not as if we want to come to God, but we are prohibited by the chains of our sinful nature. No. A sinner hates God and hates the things of God. And we don't want anything to do except to indulge ourselves. That's our nature. Yes, sin is our master, but the truth is, we wouldn't have it any other way. We want sin to be our master. So we are not forced against our will when it comes to choosing sin. We want it that way. We like it that way. We think of that little creepy guy in The Lord of the Rings. We likes it. We has to have it. My precious. Was that good? Yeah, yeah. Thank you. I sign autographs and I do parties on the side. Okay. So yeah. Jesus said, actually I want you to see this. Turn to John chapter 8. John chapter 8. You see, our imprisonment to sin is not only evidenced in the fact that we practice sin, but our very practice of sin is what actively enslaves us to sin. So that enslavement to sin is a result of a habit that we allow to grow stronger in our lives. And that's why we remain in a state of sin. John chapter 8, verses 43 to 47. Jesus gets to the very reason for our disbelief and our bondage to sin. This is what Jesus says. Why do you not understand what I say? It is because you cannot bear to hear my word. You are of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. Skip down a little bit. But because I tell the truth, you do not believe me. Which one of you convicts me of sin? If I tell the truth, why do you not believe me? Whoever is of God hears the words of God. The reason why you do not hear them is that you are not of God. Now, those are shocking words, aren't they? Jesus is basically saying that his listeners don't understand because they can't bear to hear the message. Why? Because they belong to the devil. He's their father. But this whole concept about imprisonment to sin is not just evidenced because we practice it, but when we practice it, that's what enslaves us because it just reinforces a habit. Now, I call upon the one, the only Jerry Ross to come and help me with something. Come here, Jerry. Put your hands together. Break out of that. Okay. Shows your massiveness. That's great. Okay. Put your hands back in there. Now you messed up my knot.
You must not have took Boy Scouts.
Huh?
You must not have taken Boy Scouts.
I was never a Boy Scout. You know why? The scout leader used to make fun of me. Yeah, she played favorites with her kid, and I didn't like that. So I got my little badge. And you see, if Jerry continues with this habit that he has, and this habit goes on and on and on and on, eventually it gets to the point where Jerry enslaves himself to this, and it's his own choice. He chooses. You can have the things of God, or, well, I don't want the things of God. I'm familiar with this. And so I can just continue to do this. Why? Because I like it. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yep. Yep. And we think back to that wonderful, wonderful hymn of the faith, and can it be? That second verse, right? Bold I approach. No, that's not the second verse. My chains fell off, right? And so the supernatural working of God in his life is the only thing that is going to free him. Because if he's left to himself, this is the only thing he's going to choose. Why? Because he likes it. Why does he like it so much? Because it's his nature. Just like it is all of our nature. But if God comes along, of course, he sets him free. Right? Doesn't take God that long, and I left my Boy Scout knife at home. But we get the point, right? Thank you, Jerry. Yep. That's exactly right. Yes. Mhm. Yes. I have this terrible habit and I wish I could break free of it. Oh, will you pray for me? And then when we leave, what do? We go right back and we do the thing we just asked for prayer about. Why? Because that's our nature. And this is what we're talking about. You know, when it comes to the whole idea of our total depravity. Are we free to choose? Yes, we're free to choose. Why? Because we do choose, but we choose according to that which we have inherited, which is a sin nature. That is always going to choose that way. Now, we want to be careful that we don't become fatalists. Because there is a false theology called fatalism, which basically says, why bother? I mean, that's where our hyper-Calvinist friends go off the deep end when they basically say, well, listen, why should we bother sending missionaries? Because God knows who's going to be saved anyway, so eventually they're going to be saved, so forget it. Right? Doesn't God know who's going to be saved? Sure. Well, if God knows who's going to be saved, then why should we bother? Well, yeah, but if he doesn't use you, he might use somebody else. And ultimately, they're going to be saved because God knows they're going to be saved, and so on and so on and so on, and we just, spin ourselves into a hole. Exactly. This is very true. And this is why Paul said, some planted, some watered. God is the one who gave the increase. God made it grow. Right. So these are the things. All right. Paul is just as bleak as Jesus is when it comes to this whole idea of slavery to sin. Didn't we change these batteries last week? Okay. So Romans chapter 8 and verse 5, Paul says, for those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on the things of the Spirit. For to set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind of the Spirit is life and peace. For the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God, for it does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot. And those who are in the flesh cannot please God. Paul is basically demonstrating here that man will not submit to God's law because he can't. It's impossible to please God. And there are a lot of texts that talk about that. A lot of texts that talk about that. I'm going to assign some verses here and ask you to look these up. Sean, if you look up Romans 6:16, and Wendy, 1 Corinthians 2:14. Tina, 2 Corinthians 4:4. Austin, Galatians 3:23 and 4:3. 3:23 and 4:3. And Russ, Galatians 4:8 and 9. Jeremy, Galatians 4, I'm going to give you a big one, 25 to 31. Emma, 2 Timothy 2, 25 and 26. Ken, Titus 1, 15 and 16. And Cliff, Titus 3:3. Jamie, Ephesians 2, 1 through 3. Bob, Ephesians 4, 17 to 19. And Jim, Colossians 2:13. Okay? Now, listen to these. Romans 6:16.
Do you not know that to whom you present yourselves slaves to obey, you are that one slave whom you obey, whether of sin leading to death or of obedience leading to righteousness?
Whoever you present yourself to obey, you're slaves to that one, whether it's sin or righteousness. 1 Corinthians 2:14.
The natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are folly to him, and he is not able to understand them because they are spiritually discerned.
2 Corinthians 4:4. All right. Galatians 3:23 and 4:3. And 4:3. So do you see a theme here? We're beginning to develop this theme. All right. And Russ? Yeah, you desire again to be in bondage. Yeah, if we can read a little bit louder. Jeremy, chapter 4, 25 to 31. Okay? That's a little tricky there. I won't comment for sake of time. Thank you for reading that. Emma? Mhm. And Ken, Titus? And Titus 3:3. Did I give that to someone? Yeah. I mean, that was our lifestyle. That's what he's saying. Ephesians 2, 1-3. Okay. And 17-19 of chapter 4. Okay. And Jim. So where does life come from? God made you alive. Because naturally, in and of ourselves, it's not possible. What's possible is our penchant for choosing. We still have the capacity to choose, and it is a free choice. But when we make that choice and exercise choice, choice is always going to lean towards sin. Now, I know that messes with our minds logically, but we're not talking about things that are necessarily logical. We're talking about things that are eternal and that are spiritual, as God has revealed it to us in His Word. And again, we're trying to understand the infinity of God in many of these things. But we want to be very, very careful that we don't say that we have no choice. Because if we say that we have no choice, then that's fatalism. And that's basically saying that God wound us all up to be sinners. But that's not true, is it? Because from the beginning, man is created in the imago Dei, right? The image of God, the image and likeness of God. And that was perfect, and that was without sin. Sin marred God's perfection. And as a result, because, as we have studied, Adam being our representative, we inherit this. And even though we still have the ability reasonably to choose, we are always going to choose that which benefits us as far as our likes and our pleasures. We're always going to choose ice cream over squash. Always. Okay? Yes. All right. Well, we're going to pause there. Hold on to these, and we'll finish our discussion next week.